Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And this time we're looking at something pretty intense.
Yeah.
You sent us a piece about Hurricane Milton. And it's not just about the storm itself, but it's really looking at it through this whole lens of biblical prophecy.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's pretty intriguing how the source just right away connects a natural disaster like a hurricane to, something like the end times. That's a pretty big leap. So there's definitely a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, so the piece kind of jumps right in. It goes right into the book of Matthew, and it quotes this passage where Jesus talks about the beginning of sorrows, and he's listing all these things like earthquakes and famines and nations fighting against each other. It's pretty heavy stuff. Yeah, and I think what's really striking about that is that the source seems to be suggesting that, we might actually be in that period of sorrows right now. It's not just saying that bad things are happening, but that, events like Hurricane Ian and Lee and now Milton, they seem to be escalating in their intensity. And it's kind of posing that question, is that a sign of something bigger? Or are we just, noticing these disasters more because of the way we consume media now?
Right. And then the source, it goes on to this other passage from Luke where Jesus describes the sea and the waves roaring. And I mean, obviously that makes you think of Hurricane Milton right away.
Of course. I mean, you can't hear that phrase without picturing, those huge waves crashing. But what's interesting is that the source also points out that phrase, distress of nations. That's also in that same passage. And it connects that to, the very real anxiety that we're seeing, the mass evacuations and the economic impact. Even Disney World shut down. There's definitely this sense of disruption and fear. So it makes you wonder, is this the kind of distress that Jesus was referring to, or are we reading too much into it?
Yeah, it makes you wonder. And then the source kind of goes even deeper. It dives into the book of Revelation, specifically the seven trumpets that herald all these catastrophic events. And I mean, the first two, it's hail and fire and a burning mountain being thrown into the sea. It's some seriously apocalyptic imagery.
Yeah, it's intense. And obviously, Hurricane Milton is not literally a mountain on fire, but the source still draws this interesting parallel.
Yeah.
The destruction that we're seeing both, on land and at sea, it echoes that sense of widespread devastation. So
Yeah.
it's kind of asking, could this hurricane, could others like it be like a foreshadowing of the events that are described in Revelation?
Yeah. It's a pretty unsettling thought. And then we've got these figures, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, or war, famine, plague, and death. I mean, you can't get much more, chaotic and suffering than that.
Right. The source makes this pretty bold statement and says that even though a hurricane is obviously a natural event, it can still produce consequences that are similar to what those horsemen represent. I mean, we're seeing destruction, we're seeing potential food shortages because of crop damage, displacement of people, and sadly, loss of life. So it's a bleak picture, but it's also realistic.
Yeah, and then the source points out that in Revelation, these calamities are often tied to the idea of divine judgment, which is a really tough concept to grapple with.
Yeah.
I mean, can we even, or should we even view natural disasters in that way today?
Yeah, that's a complex question. And to be honest, there are many different interpretations within Christianity itself on how to approach that.
Yeah.
You have some people who take a very literal view of these prophecies and others who see them more as symbolic or metaphorical. The source doesn't really give a definitive answer, which I think is interesting. It seems like it's more prompting the listener to think about their own perspective on that.
Okay, so we've got all these really intense images of judgment and the end times, but then the source kind of shifts gears a little bit and brings up the book of Job. And Job, of course, went through just unimaginable suffering. And he even questioned God about why all these things were happening to him.
Right, exactly. And in the book of Job, God basically reminds Job that he has control over all of creation, including, forces of nature. He talks about commanding the hail and the snow and holding them in reserve for, these times of trouble. So it seems like the source is using that passage to emphasize that nothing, not even a hurricane like Milton, happens outside of God's, awareness and permission.
So does that provide comfort knowing that, God is ultimately in control even in a disaster like this? Or does it create even more questions about why suffering is allowed to occur in the first place?
That's a really personal question. I think what the source is getting at is that even though we might not understand the reasons behind certain events, we can still trust that God has a purpose, even when it seems like everything's just chaos and destruction.
Yeah, it's interesting how the source kind of brings in all these different parts of the Bible. We've got these warnings and prophecies, and then also these glimpses of hope, all centered around this one event, Hurricane Milton.
Yeah, what I find really striking is how the source uses Hurricane Milton as kind of a jumping off point for a much bigger conversation.
Yeah.
It's not just about interpreting this specific storm as like a sign of the end times, but it's more about using this event as a lens through which we can view, our own lives and our relationship with God and our responsibilities to the world around us.
Right. Speaking of responsibility, the source definitely doesn't let us off the hook easily. It talks about the church being a light in the darkness, which feels like a pretty big call to action, especially in the face of a disaster like this.
Absolutely. And, it goes beyond just providing that immediate relief and aid, which is obviously crucial. But the source challenges us to think about, what does it actually mean to be a beacon of hope in a world that seems to be experiencing, more and more crises, both natural and human caused.
Yeah, so what does that look like in a practical sense? How can we actually embody that call to be light in the midst of so much darkness?
Well, the source points us to the example of Jesus, which makes sense if we're looking at this through, a Christian lens. Jesus constantly reached out to those who were suffering, those who were marginalized, those who were in need. And he didn't just talk about love and compassion. He actively lived it out in very practical ways.
You're right. He healed the sick. He fed the hungry. He comforted those who were grieving. And of course, there's that story of him calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee, which the source keeps coming back to.
Yeah, that story is so powerful because it reminds us that even in the midst of all that chaos and fear, there's this possibility for peace. We might not be able to calm literal storms, but the source seems to be suggesting that we can be bringers of peace in other ways. We can offer comfort and support and practical help to those who are struggling.
It's about being the hands and feet of Christ, right? Showing God's love in those tangible ways, meeting practical needs, being that listening ear, that shoulder to cry on, offering a word of encouragement.
Exactly. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer is just a reminder that someone isn't alone in their suffering. Just a simple act of kindness, like offering a prayer or a hug, can make a huge difference.
Yeah, that's so true. It reminds us that even in the face of all this devastation, there's always room for hope, for love, for human connection.
And the source also emphasizes the power of collective action, especially through prayer. It talks about the church coming together in unity, lifting their voices to God on behalf of those who are suffering, asking for his mercy, his healing, his comfort.
Yeah, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and helpless when we see the scope of the damage caused by Hurricane Milton.
Right.
But the source suggests that prayer is not passive. It's a way of actively engaging with a power greater than ourselves.
Right. It's about surrendering our need to control everything, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, and trusting that even when we can't see it, God is at work.
That sense of surrender and trust seems to be a recurring theme throughout this whole piece. It's like an invitation to let go of our anxieties and fears and lean into something bigger than ourselves.
Especially in times of crisis, when everything feels unstable and uncertain, it's so easy to grasp for control. But the source reminds us that even when our world is shaking, there's this solid foundation that we can stand on. It might not be a physical foundation, but it's that unwavering belief that God is present, he's working, and he has a plan for redemption and restoration.
And it's interesting how the source connects that idea of God's plan to the promise of a new heaven and a new earth where there will be no more suffering or disasters. It's almost like a reminder that this present reality, as difficult as it may be, is not the end of the story.
Yeah, that's such a powerful perspective to hold on to, especially when we're surrounded by all the brokenness and devastation of this world. The source seems to be saying that even though we experience hardship and loss, there's this larger narrative of hope unfolding this story of God making all things new.
And that story, that promise that gives us something to hold on to, something to work towards it, fuels our actions, our compassion, our commitment to making a difference in the here and now.
That's the heart of it, isn't it? It's not about ignoring the pain and suffering of this present world. It's about acknowledging it, engaging with it, and working towards a better future, all while holding on to that belief that God is with us every step of the way.
We've covered a lot of ground here, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of what this source has to offer. It's really sparked a lot of questions for me, and I imagine it's doing the same for you listening in.
It definitely has. And that's the beauty of engaging with material like this.
Yeah.
It challenges us to think deeply, to ask those hard questions, to wrestle with our own beliefs and doubts, and ultimately to come to a richer understanding of faith. And what it means, in the face of real world events like Hurricane Milton.
It's not about finding, easy answers or pat solutions. It's about embarking on that journey of exploration and discovery,
Hmm.
a conversation that continues to unfold long after we finish discussing it. So we've been on this journey with this source material, it started with Hurricane Milton, and we've touched on some pretty intense themes like biblical prophecy and divine judgment, even the four horsemen of the apocalypse.
Yeah, it's been a deep dive for sure.
Yeah.
But even with all those, weighty topics, there's also this thread of hope that keeps running through it all. The source keeps coming back to that idea of God's ultimate plan, for redemption, for new creation where suffering is gone.
Right. It's like even when you're looking at those, darkest possibilities, the source is still saying, hey, there's this bigger picture, the story of restoration and renewal that we need to remember.
And what's so fascinating to me is how the source uses this very real event, Hurricane Milton was devastating, to point us towards these deeper truths. It's almost like the storm itself becomes a way for us to think about things differently,
Yeah.
To ask those big questions about life and faith and where we fit in all of this.
It definitely makes you reevaluate things. When you see that kind of raw power of nature, it's hard not to think about what really matters. Your priorities, what you value, the things you rely on for security.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty natural response.
Yeah.
Disasters, whether it's a hurricane or something people cause it, they have a way of shaking us up, making us confront some hard realities like our own vulnerability, how fragile life is, how the things we think are permanent really aren't.
Earlier we talked about the idea of repentance, which this source brings up a few times, and that can be a tough concept, especially when you're talking about a natural disaster. It's easy to feel like someone's pointing fingers saying, this happened because people weren't good enough.
Right. I get why someone would feel that way.
Yeah.
But I think the source is asking us to look at repentance a little differently. It's not about guilt or shame.
Yeah.
It's more about shifting your perspective, turning away from the things that separate us from God and from each other.
Yeah.
Things like selfishness, greed, not caring about people who are hurting.
So it's not so much Hurricane Milton happened because people were bad, but more like recognizing that we're all connected and what we do or don't do has an impact.
Exactly. We all contribute to the brokenness of the world, whether we know it or not.
Yeah.
And repentance in this context is about owning the brokenness in ourselves and in the systems we create and actively trying to be better.
There's humility in that, being willing to say, okay, I'm part of this.
Yeah.
And the source reminds us there's hope in that too. God's always there, ready to forgive, to restore things, to help us make things right.
And that's where prayer comes in. It's not about begging God to just fix everything. It's more about trying to align ourselves with God's will, asking for guidance, strength, wisdom to deal with the stuff we're facing, especially after something like Hurricane Milton.
It's about letting go of that need to control everything and trusting that God's working even when it seems totally chaotic and we don't understand.
That trust, that surrender, it gives you strength.
Yeah.
It lets you face the future with hope, even when things are really tough, because you're not going through it alone. You're connected to something much bigger than yourself.
This source keeps talking about the church's role in responding to disasters. And it's not just about sending help, though, that's important.
Right, there's more to it. It's about showing God's love. The source calls the church to be that beacon of hope, that real expression of compassion.
Like being the hands and feet of Christ, reaching out to those who are hurting, offering comfort, support, practical help. Being that light in the darkness, showing people there's real hope and healing.
And doing it together as a community, knowing we're stronger that way. We each have something to offer, gifts and talents we can use to help heal and restore.
That image of the church as a light, it's so powerful. Even when things are terrible, it reminds us there's still a reason to hope, a reason to believe that things will get better.
And that hope isn't just wishful thinking. It's based on something much deeper. It's rooted in the promises of God and that vision of a new creation, where there's no pain, no suffering, no more disasters.
It's a hope that motivates us to act, to be part of making things better, even if it's just in small ways.
And ultimately, that hope is all about Jesus. He chose to come into our brokenness, to experience suffering, and to conquer death and bring new life.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I feel challenged, but also really challenged to live out my faith, to be that source of hope, to make a difference.
And encouraged to remember that we're not alone. We have a God who loves us, who walks with us through every hard thing, and who's always working to bring good even when we can't see it.
It's been a great conversation, and I think it'll stick with people long after this is over.
I hope so. And as you go back to your daily life, maybe you'll carry some of these ideas with you. Events like Hurricane Milton as awful as they are, can be like wake-up calls, making us look at our lives, our values, our relationship with something bigger.
They can be chances to grow, to have more compassion, to recommit to loving and serving others.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep searching for truth.
And keep finding hope, even in the storms.